Right, that's enough of the announcements. I want to introduce Lisa Garforth, our speaker at this plenary. Lisa is a senior lecturer in sociology at the University of Newcastle, and this is, we find very interesting, because we are both sociologists, and we have a suspicion that we're the only sociologists at this conference, right? We're either a dying breed, well actually the utopian sociologists are a dying breed, okay, right, that will do actually. We've been bought by the various research councils who want us to measure things. Right, however, she is a senior lecturer in sociology, and she's also the author of Green Utopias, Environmental Hope Before and After Nature, which was published last year by Polity. 2017? Amazon said it. Amazon said 2018. Right, okay. It's, anyway, whether it was last year or the year before, it is in fact by Polity Press, and you can buy it on Amazon, as I've just pointed out. Lisa is, she's also been associated, she's at the University of Newcastle, and she was one of the people, along with Nathaniel and others, who organised the 2015 Utopian Studies Conference at Newcastle. Those of you who were there will remember that the weather was a bit like this, which is astonishing. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be rude about Newcastle, but really, the northeast of England is not known for its tropical thunderstorms, but we did actually have one, right? I've gone to lots of Utopian Studies conferences in Europe and said to people like Lisa, I'm sorry, we can't reciprocate and organise a conference in Melbourne. But yes, we can. Well, not quite Melbourne, but I would like to say, Lisa, welcome to Australia. I hope you enjoy Prato as much as we enjoyed Newcastle. The title of the talk is Green Utopia, as you can see, Imagining the Anthropocene. And we'll move into questions in about an hour's time. Less than.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, great. And thanks, Adam, actually, belatedly, for being a star at organising our conference in Newcastle a few years ago. It's absolutely delightful to be here at Utopian Studies Society number 20. Slightly astonished to be here, talking about my work. I'm also essentially the warm-up act to Darko Suvin, so I hope you'll all just adjust your expectations accordingly. What I'm going to try and talk about today, then, is what I've been thinking about for 15 or 20 years, which is to say how we think about green utopias in the face of enormous changes in cultural and social conditions. I'm going to try and explore a little bit how climate change has fundamentally shifted the conditions for green utopias in Western cultures and societies, but show too, I hope, how green utopianism persists as a crucial resource for navigating, imagining, inhabiting Anthropocene times. So I'll briefly introduce myself a little bit and my work for the many of you I know who won't know it. I've been working on environmental utopias and utopianism for the best part of 20 years. And I think mainly what I bring to this keynote is sheer longevity and persistence in some ways. I'm not going to claim any unique insights or novel theoretical perspectives. This topic has never quite let me go, although I think I've tried to let it go several times, but it's never quite let me go. And I tried to bring the scholarship together in this book, Green Utopias, Environmental Hope Before and After Nature, the title of which, for many of you, will kind of invoke some of the concerns I've been trying to work through, particularly this idea of a kind of post-natural environmental philosophy. Those ideas, as Andrew has intimated, are rooted in my home discipline of sociology. Historically, many of you will know, especially if you're acquainted with the work of Ruth Levitas, I know, little known name in the field, but you might have heard of her, have not been all that common in sociology. We've been not attentive to speculation, fantasy, fiction and hope as much as we have to more conventional forms of realism, quantitative and qualitative description and critique. But for me, utopia is always a social thing. It comes from society insofar as specific social processes and problems generate particular green utopian visions at different historical moments. And of course, utopias can speak, although they don't always, to some vision of society, of some notion of collective alternative structures, arrangements, cultures, ways of life at a scale beyond the individual, and increasingly beyond the human, but we'll come to that later. So although rooted in sociology, I've always worked across disciplines, especially with green political theory and philosophies which explore ideologies and values in opposition to those driving the damaging late capitalism we currently have, working on how the emergence of Western environmental thought in the 1960s and 1970s brought radically different ideas of human and non-human well-being, radically different approaches to environmental and social justice into Western policy and cultural discourse. And I've always worked quite a lot with fiction, speculative fiction, thinking about different formal attempts to envisage better, greener societies, thinking about how alternative visions are expressed and the capacity of speculative fiction to educate desire, critically as strangers from the present, make radically sustainable and just alternatives feel real and compelling. So I've worked a lot with fictional utopian texts, although I'm not, as will be evident as the talk progresses, a literary critic or a science fiction studies expert. And in fact, one of the things I love about utopian studies conferences is that I get a kind of almost too intense catch-up with what new texts and literatures people are currently reading. I feel like I work at a speed about a fifth that of literature people in relation to my understanding of novels. And I hope to learn a lot about that in the next couple of days, next 2 or 3 days. But I am interested in these fictional texts because, for me, they've always done something that my own home discipline can't or won't so far do. Offer a kind of speculative sociology of possible societies, desirable societies, that might help us all engage both cognitively and affectively with how we might live and who we might be in radically different green worlds. And I've been fortunate to learn in and from this amazing and quite unlikely entity, the Utopian Studies Society, for quite a long time. In fact, I think my first conference was in Oporto in 2004, where I have to say the quality of the coffee and pastries gave me an entirely misleading idea of what academic conferences would be like. And those of you who've been enjoying the lunches and breakfasts here might find, especially when you go back to the UK, that might very much be your experience. It's always wonderful to work with interdisciplinary, international, welcoming community of scholars, really inquisitive, open-minded, creative people, and to hear in plenaries like this from scholars whose work has shaped and inspired mine. And I'll just very briefly mention 2 names, Ruth Levitas and Lucy Sargison, whose work's been really influential for me. This year, then, it's really something to see a whole conference themed on climate and utopia, and I intend to learn a lot. I'd like to say that it's really great to see all this work going on. But those of you who do work on climate futures know that it isn't great, really, to be working on the prospects of utopia in times framed by predictions of enormous ecological and social disruption, intensifications of global and local environmental and economic injustice. Anyone who works in this area will know it comes with a side order of feelings of fear and uncertainty about changes already in train, feelings of grief sometimes about what has already been lost, feelings of belatedness about what could have been done in the last decades, and feelings of helplessness about what's still not being done now. So we work and we try and work without solutions, but with hope and commitment, I think, in this period of what often feels like a suspension between knowledge and action, in this period that Kim Stanley Robinson in 2312 calls the dithering, which Dan Haraway glosses as a state of indecisive agitation around climate. In this state, some of us are still fortunate enough to enjoy an ordinary, everyday life in which we anticipate ordinary, everyday futures, but they are penetrated, certainly for me and perhaps for many of you, or overlaid all the time by apocalyptic scenarios, apocalyptic aesthetics, effects, and threaded through, if you like, with the undeniable knowledge that there is inevitable destruction already in train and real slow violence already happening in relation to climate change. So, of course, it's not great to be having a whole conference on utopia and climate. Climate as a problem isn't just difficult, it's intractable. It's not just big, it's the size of a planet, possibly a hyperobject, if you follow Timothy Morton's reasoning, or not, as the case may be. It's not just multifaceted, it is, as Mike Hume explains it, wicked. Not just a challenge to the future of business as usual, but perhaps to the very idea of a future. In the face of the scale, severity and complexity of the climate challenge, calls for optimism and hope can feel like thin, co-opted responses, unidimensional and fragile. Too easily co-opted by what Paul Wapner, a political scientist but who works with sociology and the sociological imagination, I think that's the more appropriate slide, calls Climate Inc., those well-oiled institutions that adopt market solutions and conventional regulations to try and manage what feels like the unmanageable, sustain the politics of unsustainability. those policies and politics that acknowledge crisis only to refuse or efface more radical responses. Those discourses that insist on realism only to retrench an impossible reality. Dominant contemporary policy responses to climate change, adaptation, resilience, they feel weak and individualising, reluctant to contemplate the utter incapacity of capital to change, unimaginative, inadequate to the urgency and scale of the challenge. So, as I've already indicated, I'm not going to solve climate change now, and I hope that's not what you're here for, and I'm not going to be positive or hopeful or optimistic in the arguments I make in this talk. The conditions for thinking about better futures with nature in the face of the current climate impasse are extremely challenging. But I am going to insist that green utopias persist, and through this period of climate knowledge and denial, they still persist, even though action is inadequate, responses are routinised, many of us dither. Utopias, for me, are part of the cultural and social responses with which we will work our way through it one way or another, and they are more than ever important to think with. So this is a warning, I think, also for some of you that I am an utter maximalist in relation to what I think a utopia is and can be, and maybe we can talk about that at the end. But the context, forms, functions of green utopianism have in the last years been thoroughly and intensively reshaped with climate crisis as part of that. So what I want to bring to this debate then is a sense both of the persistence of green political utopianism over the last 50 years or so, and to think about how it's been constrained and reshaped by the climate challenge. And I want to start by going back a bit to where my own thinking began about green or ecological utopias 20 years ago or so, and reflect a little bit on what's changed. What endures for me is an interest in how we envision better ways of living with others, both human and non-human, in ways that eschew exploitation and domination, how we imagine a society that will be more rewarding, more pleasurable, more satisfying, but also more economically, ecologically and socially just. And I think one of the things that's changed for me have been some of the terms that I've used to capture this. I used to think, for example, about ecological utopias. Utopias that express the desire for a better way of living and being in terms of ecocentric or nature-loving philosophies, in which human well-being was rethought as being contingent on restoring ecosystems and restoring ourselves as humans to the natural world. And this was inspired by deep ecology and other radical green philosophies that focus on re-embedding spiritual and romantic ecology. I used to think then that green utopias were about saving nature, and by saving nature, saving ourselves from an alienated and commodified life in industrial progressive societies with their colonial injustices and structural violences. I talk a lot more now about this category of green utopias or green utopianism. And I often define green utopianism as something like that desire for a better way of living and being, borrowed from Ruth Levitas, of course, with what we used to call nature. This thing called nature, then, I think, can no longer unproblematically, be the end of green critique or the content of utopian alternatives. Whether we are talking about the modern constitution's category of a separate nature, after Latour, or about the irreversible human impacts changing the planet from the atmosphere down to the depths of the deepest oceans, there is no untouched nature to save, and it cannot save us spiritually, ethically, or politically. The idea of inhabiting, though, has been part of my approach to green futures since I first wrote about this some 20 years ago. And that term, that idea, has also been shifting around, I hope productively for me, in the last few years. I first started writing about green utopian fiction, and specifically about these novels, about Le Guin's Always Coming Home, Piercy's Woman on the Edge of Time, and Kim Stanley Robinson's Pacific Edge. If you can imagine a time when no one had ever heard of that, or him, more or less, outside of some very specialist circles, that's how long ago this was, more than 20 years ago, if I'm honest. I was primarily interested in how speculative fiction could creatively imagine and communicate the lived textures of alternative green societies that we might want to live in. I wanted to work on and with science fiction, how those worlds work on and with science fiction readers, not just to cognitively estrange them from the world we have, but to affectively enchant them, to help them, readers, imaginatively inhabit better social worlds, and obviously by them, readers, I mean me. The idea of inhabitation here then also gestures at deep green philosophical ideas about bioregional re-inhabitation, about the need for humans to think themselves back into a home with ecosystems and the wider natural world. Inhabitation then, I thought, was about imagining living closely and attentively with nature in very particular environments. And I think, actually, I probably appropriated the idea of inhabitation from Ursula K. Le Guin. And who among us cannot say we haven't nicked many of our best ideas from Ursula K. Le Guin? And wouldn't the world be a much better place if more of us did? Oh, sorry, the type's gone a bit wonky on that one, but nonetheless, I think it probably makes the point. So I worked a lot with this essay, A Non-Euclidean View of California as a Cold Place to Be, which I know many of you will know from 1982 in Dancing at the Edge of the World, to develop some of these ideas. And Le Guin urges us in that essay to abandon the machine model of utopia and have a go at the organic. She talks in that essay about the capacity of utopia to project an inhabitable future, and she defines that as a place where people can live, quite simply, in which structures follow from process rather than vice versa. Le Guin, as many of you will know, urges us to construe the future not as a point on a line, colonised by the projected values of the present, but to treat it instead as a space where we can posit an imagined people who, like Herkesh in the valley in Always Coming Home, have always lived there, outside our aggressive, lineal, progressive, creative, expanding, advancing history, she puts it, in another time and place that can only be found by advancing or proceeding roundabout or sideways. So when I started to work on Green Utopias, this motif of inhabiting, for me, felt as if it was about the challenge of making projected or future sustainable societies feel real enough to want to live in and work for, and to position fiction as particularly important in bringing those imagined sustainable social structures to life, to make them affectively inhabitable. But this has changed quite a lot in the last few years. The idea of inhabitation now seems to me to be less a challenge about bringing non-existent futures to life in the present, and more about what it means to live in, live with, to fully inhabit a climate-changed world. A world already marked by the knowledge of irreversible damage and changes in train. I think about utopia, perhaps more precisely utopianism, although we can, and doubtless will, have some interesting exchanges about definitions at the end of the talk, as something we need to be able to live critically and creatively on and with a deeply in and with a deeply unsettled present, more ethically, more attentively, more wisely. And that brings us to the climate change part of the talk. The puzzle I've been working with really for the last 10 years or so is something like this. What happens to green utopian thought when the future is colonised already by scientific modelling, by mundane, everyday apocalyptics, by the insistence every day that we can adapt and continue with business as usual in the face of the increasing knowledge of the failure of so-called ecological modernisation, the impossibility of making capitalist development sustainable? What happens to green utopian thought when the category of nature, however radically mobilised, no longer holds up to critical scrutiny, and when what we used to call nature is self-evidently fragile, dependent, muddled into socio-technical systems and relentlessly transformed and retransformed by commodity logics? So I thought I'd start with, some of the small questions and then work up. But it is at that slightly absurd level of big questions that I've been trying to think about, and I've only got small answers. But I'll share with you a little bit the way I've been thinking about this and hope that contributes to some bigger answers. I don't need to tell this audience, I hope, that in important ways utopia cannot be about the future. But in post-war environmental thought, extrapolating and imagining future trajectories of planetary, economic and ecological systems was a key way of doing critique and envisaging alternatives. In fact, the very idea of the environment as an object of political, policy and philosophical concern is arguably constituted precisely by predictions and concerns about its future throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Anticipations of crisis, though, also created a space for their opposite, utopian desire for a better way of living and being with nature in opposition to the catastrophic risks of economic and political business as usual. But by the 1990s, I think, by the late part of the 20th century, that stark contrast between future environmental apocalypse on one hand and radical visions of ecocentric alternatives was breaking down. By the early 2000s, Frederick Buell was arguing that the figure of environmental crisis had already shifted from a threat in the future to something that had imploded, if you like, into everyday life and experience. Apocalypse had become a way of life. Environmental crisis then used to be something like a fable for tomorrow, as in Carson's first chapter of Carson's Silent Spring, or the prospect of overshoot and collapse, according to the Club of Rome in the Limits to Growth, 100 years from 1970. The environmental predicament, though, on my reading, has gone from a projection to being something that's now absorbed into the present. Climate change is, or certainly has been, about future projections, but it also brings a new kind of erasure of the future to bear on discursive spaces for imagining green alternatives. The mechanisms of global warming are about the irreversible accumulation of greenhouse gases and the unfolding of delayed effects over decades and centuries. The carbon and methane particulates that will trap heat energy in the atmosphere for decades to come have already been emitted, and out with dramatic geoengineering solutions, form part of the accumulations that will cause warming and all its dramatic effects: sea level rises, polar ice cap melt, the increasing prevalence of severe weather systems for decades and centuries to come. These temporal logics of climate change, then, are unlike older environmental discourses and predictions. The future has been set in motion. We are locked into dynamics already underway. As Jerry Canavan has put it, the climate has always already been changed for us now. The future can seem close to agency and desire, and there's a pervasive sense of belatedness about this, I think, that it's always already too late, that multiple possibilities have always already been closed down. At the same time, global climate policies in the early 21st century can make the future seem only like a continuation of business as usual, rather than a space for imagining radical alternatives. In policy discourse and governance discourse, there is adaptation, policies which support adjustments to build resilience so that communities can continue to live alongside warming effects, a realistic and necessary response to real threats, but one that continues to suggest that the climate problematic can be addressed without changes to economic and social structures. On the other hand, mitigation policies constantly project multiple future scenarios and try to suggest that there are rational, logical, efficient choices to be made between points of intervention. So in my incredibly reductive way, I'm talking about a kind of vision of the future in an environmental discourse that goes from one line that either goes up or collapses to the kind of colonisation of the future by multiple possible projections of different climate scenarios, depending on at what point and how heavily societies intervene in emissions. They present what Mike Hume calls a delusion of calculation and control, making over climate futures in the confident image of technocratic management that is already failing in the present. But of course, that's not the end of the story. Anthropogenic climate change futures are now seriously on the cultural agenda, generating, as many of you will know much better than me, multiple post-apocalyptic and dystopian scenarios: worlds without us, worlds without nature, post-apocalyptic survivor scenarios of all kinds. I started trying to sketch in what some of those might be and decided it might be better for me to just learn from you lot in various panels what those might be. Climate apocalyptics and dystopias then can be read as reflective of populist post-politics or symptoms of cultural fatalism or pessimism, and they certainly are in the social sciences repeatedly. But they can also be read in terms of their capacity to perform critique, forms of refusal and renewal. They can be a corrective, I think, as much to the dominance of sustainable development, adaptation and mainstream ecological modernisation discourses as they have been fearful and pessimistic sketches of what might be to come. But they have nonetheless saturated the future with visions of end times that perhaps don't have the critical charge they may have once had. I'm suggesting then that for the last 10 or 15 years, climate change has radically shrunk the scope of the future to operate as a space for projecting green alternatives. And it's no surprise, I think, in those contexts that certainly for a long time it felt that there were very few formal attempts to project fully blown green utopian fictions, although I think that's probably changing now, and I'll be delighted to hear that from the audience if we can talk about it in the questions. But the erasure of the future is not all. We need now to think about green utopias after the end of nature, one way or another. In 1989, Bill McKibben soberly and sadly announced the end of nature and tied it tightly to climate change. The point at which humans have changed the very composition of the atmosphere, he argued, is the end of pristine nature and the end of a certain way of being human, being smaller than something fundamentally other, wild and separate. In these conditions, McKibben prescribed a need for mourning and a demand to save what was left, return humbled to a depleted but still wild world. At its heart of this claim is a kind of unreflexive insistence that a love of nature can save it and save us, however damaged. And a lot of theorists, as many of you will know, suggest that the proper response to climate change is loss. It's narratives and discourses of mourning and grief, that there needs to be a working through of sadness and guilt in relation to biodiversity loss and damage on a planetary scale, in relation to the anthropogenic nature of that damage. Mourning a memory of what is lost, of course, can mobilise some utopian desires and affects that might encourage us to live better with what used to be nature. And this registering of the end of nature and narratives of mourning and loss, I think, reflects something really important in contemporary cultural understandings of the environmental predicament. But what utopianism it offers is inevitably fleeting, fragmented, compromised, contradictory. There is another strand of end of nature writing, though, announced by social and political theorists who argue that the very idea of nature has become an impediment to learning to live better in a more than human world and in relation to climate crisis. Under the signs of post-humanism, or the new materialism, object-oriented ontologies, actor-network theory, feminist materialism, techno-scientific politics, pick whichever one applies most to the kind of field you work in if you know those kinds of modes of thought. The category of nature is increasingly held to be redundant, to get in the way of new possibilities for better epistemologies, ethics and politics. The end of nature in this sense leaves an earlier tradition of nature-centric, ecocentric, utopian vision, looking pastoral, privileged, parochial, retreats into what Timothy Morton calls an affirmative and compensatory Edenic local. In these kinds of approaches, the end of nature comes not so much with mourning, and with a lot of gleeful celebration. Obviously, I pick Latour because his voice has been most prominent in that glee, I think. And there is, I've argued, a kind of utopian energy in the way these possibilities for better ways of living and being in a post-natural world are expressed. Latour's work, for example, provokes us to think what new modes of existence, what new political institutions we might discover if we could just own up to the messy, networked impurity of technosocial worlds, the worlds we've made and the worlds that we must learn to live with. And in Latour's own discourse, this is not just about settling for a kind of technosocial world, but live the good life with non-human others and the networks that we've made. Others, Jane Bennett, Anna Singh, Holly Jean Buck, in my own field, have called for a kind of re-enchantment, not of nature as a pure, separate, wild, beautiful thing. Instead, they locate the possibility of something new and something good in celebrating and wondering at connection, hybridity, assemblages. These are Donna Haraway's utopias without essences in excelsis, a world without distinctions, rigid distinctions between self and other, object and subject, culture and nature, the social and the scientific. Getting rid of nature here would allow us to reimagine the common good of a post-human collective. And this starts, according to Jane Bennett, with cultivating new forms of attentive wonder to the liveliness of non-human things, or perhaps, if we follow Morton, the uncanny and unsettling experience of living in a much bigger, stranger, non-human, mesh-like world than the idea of nature could ever capture. Claims about the end of nature, though, circulate uncomfortably, I think, at this moment when very conventional nature images, perhaps now definitely nature simulacra, very intensively and extensively reproduce a kind of visions of a constructed sublime from David Attenborough's Blue Planet 2, or even the mundane pleasures of the UK's Humble Spring Watch, which some of you will know. So what kinds of green utopias then are possible when nature is simultaneously loved, damaged and missed, anxiously represented and radically absent, when getting back to nature cannot frame ideas about sustainable social forms? I've been thinking a bit more recently about how formal genre utopias are responding to this problematic in my head about the absence of nature in the future. And I thought I would have a bit of a think about this by looking at Kim Stanley Robinson's New York 2140. This is the contractually obligatory Kim Stanley Robinson portion of the keynote, I think. No, it's not quite that strong, but I felt it would be cruel not to talk a little bit about KSR, especially because I've written a lot about Pacific Edge, which I'm going to go back to now. To think about New York 2140, and particularly the relationship between that novel and the earlier Orange County trilogy, and particularly Pacific Edge, which many of you will know, published in 1990, set in 2065. These two novels, published 30 years apart, not very long really, but almost worlds apart, I think, have something to tell us about the different social worlds, historical moments and ecological discourses that have produced them. And that includes, of course, not least, Robinson's own very explicit turn to actor-network theory and post-natural strands of science studies, which are very vivid, as those of you who've made it to the end of New York 2140, which is quite a long book, will know. At the same time, those two novels, I think, also speak to each other across those decades and across their different contexts about what might still matter if we want to think seriously about green utopias before and after nature. I'm sure many of you will know that Pacific Edge is the formerly green utopian volume of a trilogy projecting different futures for the same place, Orange County in Southern California, and involving some of the same characters and people, although transfigured by their different social circumstances. And that those three books are generically framed as a dystopia, a post-apocalyptic survival novel, and a kind of green, democratic, socialist, critical utopia. In Pacific Edge, then, we get to know Kevin Claiborne and his friends in their sustainable, equitable world in which capitalist corporations have been cut down to size, legal regulations support sustainable economics, towns incorporate grassroots local democracy, and a culture of physical connection with beach, ocean and wild hills has supplanted an empty culture of commodity and cheap entertainment. Those of you who know the novels will know that one of its chief appeals is its moping, miserable central character, Kevin, disappointed in love, incredulous about the boring work of local politics, but nonetheless fighting to preserve a local nondescript nature spot, Rattlesnake Hill, from commercial development. In the bigger picture, he's struggling to renew a kind of utopian, green utopian spirit, the one that drove his grandfather, Tom Bernard, who helped to transform our society essentially into Kevin's, to try and remake a community alive to wilderness that makes room for non-productive places, stays open to a kind of ecocentric impulse. In Pacific Edge, then, we start to learn how ordinary citizens might make the legal and political and civic structures of a sustainable, satisfying and just society, and how members of those imagined future societies work to keep them alive. New York 2140 does something not dissimilar, but this time the novel ends at the fragile point of emergence of a radical new political ecological settlement rather than working through its realisation. New York 2140 also projects, I think, three different futures, this time for New York City in the 22nd century. But here, the multiple futures are, if you like, crammed into a single novel, a single narrative. I think you could make a reasonably convincing argument that the text simultaneously works through genres of the post-apocalyptic, the utopian and the dystopian, crowding together in the future present of the novel's setting, hybridized, destabilizing each other, making new connections. New York 2140 is set after two global pulses of sea level rises have reshaped the livable Earth, particularly its coastal cities. Manhattan is partly submerged with an intertidal zone subject to temporary surges and swells. And the city is constantly rebuilding around this new wet. It's marked by the worst excesses of disaster, capitalism, as investment rushes into climate-ruined places and then flees when they no longer become profitable. And betting on financial futures, particularly through property investment, continues in the face of unimaginable human despair. But it's not strictly or simply a post-apocalyptic novel, especially in the voice of the New York citizen who appears frequently to narrate the long sweep of history that contextualizes the novel's future-present world. There is no last man, there are no ruins, there is no elegy, there are no ends. Climate change is a long, slow convulsion that has to be lived through over and over again. In the wake of catastrophic climate events in the novel, there have been dystopian social responses, emergency powers, aggressive policing, clampdowns on freedom of speech, and most importantly, perhaps, the grinding out of continued waves of shock doctrine financial capitalism that leave the poorest exposed and vulnerable, and even the relatively well-off precarious. The novel traces the coming together of a motley band of protagonists who manage to kind of knock the system off balance by the denouement, but it's not really a genre dystopia. Not least because New York 2140 shows people building, in limited ways, satisfying, collaborative lives together, as well as making strange new partnerships with a mutated and disrupted non-human world that they've inherited. The narrative focuses on the MetLife Tower, its feet in water, its highest floors, home to an apartment cooperative offering mutual support, modest self-sufficiency and collective innovation. And the novel gestures beyond this at some hybrid, interstitial, threatened pockets of utopianism, if you like, emerging from the social and technical experimentation of this post-climate convulsed world that are always under threat, but also there's always this possibility that they might join up together the way the sky bridges across the flooded streets do to bring people together. What struck me really about these two novels was a surprising continuity for me, I think, about what a good life and what good social forms for humans and non-humans might be like in Robinson's work. There is almost always a degree of self-sufficiency, the nearly self-sufficient little farms that Kevin in Pacific Edge wedges into these reimagined, reconfigured apartment buildings, taking buildings designed for the atomistic living of the mid and late 20th century to remake them as spaces of cooperation and comfort beyond the nuclear family, spaces of mutual support. We join characters sharing the boring but necessary labour of patching up common spaces and shared infrastructures in both novels. In both novels, politics is always at heart, local to the point of utter tedium, always fully lived to the point of utter tedium, comprising combinations of anti-capitalist ideology and earnest struggle, but also low cunning, bureaucratic leverage and opportunistic intervention. Both novels also attend to the capacity of wild, uncanny, unknowable forces to reshape people's sense of self and place. In both novels, characters experience what they self-describe as epiphanies in natural settings. In New York 2140, that's Franklin, a kind of wide boy financial futures expert turned reluctant radical at the end, who meditates on seagrass as he kind of zips through the flooded ruins, the flooded buildings of New York. In Pacific Edge, Kevin Claiborne is filled with a holy tingling as he rushes on his bike through fields of scrub oak. So the question really becomes what's changed, and this is what really has made me want to think a bit about this novel. Because in New York 2140, nature has definitely gone. In Pacific Edge, the water is the ocean, and the Pacific has an edge, and the more or less utopian settlement of Almudena is at the edge. There are wild spaces that can be defended and protected. In New York 2140, the water and the city are one. The city is in the ocean, and the ocean is in the city. What was once nature pushes through, grows around, and tangles with human development. And articulating what that means, the messed up, complex world that has to be dealt with, the impossibility of getting back to nature, is articulated by a kind of media conservationist, Amelia, who travels around the world in a Zeppelin, broadcasting her adventures, doing these assisted migrations, moving species around to where they can find a new kind of habitat in what she calls a silly cloud show, a constructed reality, structured around pseudo-emergencies that put the attractive Amelia in constant apparent peril. She's always compromised, but often, as here, where she explains why we should prioritise bears over stupid, creepy, asshole ideas like purity, quite noble, I think. New York 2140, then, is a green utopia, if it is one, and we can quibble about that as well, after the end of nature. It shows how impossible it is to project utopia as a distinctly realised form into an otherwise empty future. It writes probabilities and possibilities into the future, already overcrowded with climate predictions, apocalyptic instability, financial futures and investments. It offers strange new networks of actors, including a catastrophic nature itself, who might be able always just to open up possibilities for acting as if it's possible to be the first days of a better future together. And it's that kind of ethos, I suppose I'm arguing, that we might need to inhabit the Anthropocene and try and inhabit it better. Many of you will be familiar with this idea and the various contestations over its naming and the kind of work it can do. And at first glance, this contested age of the Anthropocene might not seem to suggest much by way of utopian possibilities or have much to offer us in terms of opening up space to imagine better ways of living with what we used to call nature. In geological terms, as many of you will know, the Anthropocene is that proposed new epoch defined by humans and human systems, our structures and practices becoming a major, if not the major, geological actor on the planet, dramatically and permanently changing the Earth system and risking its capacity to support all kinds of life. For some, the Anthropocene signals impacts that go back to the emergence of settled agriculture, for others to industrial capitalism and colonialism, for others the key transition is the great acceleration post-1945 in the consumer boom led by Western economies. But in any case, the Anthropocene proposes that human and natural histories are now intractably entangled. It invites us to see ourselves as a species with earth-changing, self-destructive powers and to take some responsibility for that systematic damage to planetary systems. Now, I know that for some, the Anthropocene sounds like a new grand narrative that erases structural differences, misses the exploitative power of capital, and effaces the ways in which climate impacts and its slow violence fall routinely on the most vulnerable. But I think if we treat the Anthropocene as what Jamie Lorimer, a geographer who works on Anthropocene conservation, calls an Anthropocene, with an S-C-E-N-E, a site of intense theoretical and cultural attention that takes seriously what Anna Singh and others have called the arts of living on a damaged planet, with ourselves as different kinds of humans in relation to a different kind of world. The Anthropocene is still, as Anna Singh says, full of promising contradictions and provocations to inquire again, over and over again, into the powers of capital, technocentrism, colonialism, patriarchy, and all the other many names of the Anthropocene that we can give it, including the Chthulucene. I knew I was going to get that wrong. I did practice it a little bit. Don't know how I was Chthulucene. So for me, the Anthropocene, in its many guises, offers some resources for thinking through and past some exhausted en passes of the climate dilemma. It does propose, even if it's not realised, an inflection point of consequence that changes the name of the game of life on Earth for everybody and everything, as Donna Haraway puts it in Making Kin for the Chthulucene. It offers the rupture of a new epoch, potentially, as Jamie Lorimer argues, and as Holly Jean Book has argued, it offers a kind of imaginative forcing, or a moment of re-recognition of who we are and the kind of world we live on and with. It has actually been, as Lorimer's argued, an era of manifestos, interestingly, in the social sciences, eco-modernist, compositionist, depending on who you read. And I'm particularly fond of Holly Jean Book's proposal for a charming Anthropocene, which some of you might not know about, but you should definitely read. There have, of course, been hollow claims about the prospects for a good Anthropocene, those eco-modernist, bright green visions of further rounds of progress, centering humans' extraordinary technological and enlightened powers. But those are not the only future visions that the Anthropocene is authorising or writing. Others are looking for ways of inhabiting this Anthropocene without shortcuts, without accelerations or leaps forward, making room for attending slowly and carefully to the prospects for collaborative survival, mutual well-being and human responsibility in a precarious, damaged and more than human world. One example of that might be these, hoping that's the right slide, multi-species ethnographies like Anna Singh's Mushroom at the End of the World, which look into both promise and ruin, which explore empirically the possibilities for coexisting with environmental disturbance without either harmony or conquest, but insist that we have to live in and through those ruins. There's no acceleration away from them just by identifying the problem of the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene, then, I hope, and we have to hope, right, might be the moment in green discourse at which we leave behind the idea of environmental crisis as a projection of natural disaster versus eco-harmony into the future. If nothing else, the Anthropocene gives us a language for talking about the ways in which we already inhabit a transformed Earth and an unfolding disaster. And it can be, I hope, about rethinking responsibility, ethics, and the good society after that category has been thoroughly unsettled and shaken up. And part of that is, as Donna Haraway puts it, learning to live with the trouble, live with and through the trouble, not imagine away some unconnected, disconnected, different kind of world. Staying with the trouble means mourning and grief. It means a lot of sadness for irreversible losses of kin and creatures of all kinds. And as Leslie Head reminds us, it's about grief for the loss of a future characterised by hope, for what we understand as our future, hitherto a time and place of unlimited positive possibility. Staying with the trouble, as both Head and Haraway insist, means refusing denial wherever we find it. And I think it also means accepting that climate denial has not just been about political cynicism, capitalist interests, ignorant and ideological science denial, although of course it is about those things, and it's importantly about those things. But it does also invite us to recognise the subtler ways in which most of us, most of the time, are caught in individual modes of what Leslie Head calls turning away, and what she also calls the socially organised webs of denial, not contesting the facts of climate change, but nonetheless allowing ourselves to experience and reproduce responses of ambivalence, passivity, and above all, compartmentalisation. I wish I'd been able to make that land a bit better. The Anthropocene is about staying with the trouble, and that means that naming causes is crucial, but it's not enough. Of course the problem is capitalism. But of course the problem is capitalism in all the multiple, internalised, situated, everyday, naturalised ways that it is lived. The problem is not capitalism as a totalising explanation. And I stay with Anna Singh a little bit, who in anthropological mode reminds us that we have to live through these ruins and find new points of intervention and resistance to the leftover promises of modernisation, capital and progress. To find embedded everyday ways of resisting exploitation, vulnerability, and try to find these moments of shift towards coexistence, care, and mutual flourishing. Not from points of diagnostic certainty, but from what Haraway, again, calls the middle and the muddle. From the middle of precarity and disruption, projection and prediction, mess and multiplicity of a transformed and transforming present. Okay. So I'm going to finish up by trying to explain why I think utopia might help with all this. I can't tell you how many times I didn't finish this paper and how many times I really wanted to walk away and admit defeat. How many times I tried to write about what we can do as utopian theorists and thinkers in the middle of this chaos and difficulty. Because it is a cliche to say that inhabiting the Anthropocene will demand not just realism, but imagination. I'm sure you, like me, have read that a lot in the last 2 or 3 years. But I'll say it anyway. We need, as Donna Haraway always reminds us, to think about environmental crisis and the Anthropocene, not just in the language of scientific facts, but in the language of all the SFs that she constantly plays with, the speculative fabulations, the string figures, the science fictions. Utopia, whether those are vague desires and impulses, or formal fictional visions, or fully committed political projects, I think is more useful than hope or optimism in the face of climate change. I may be wrong. Because the lesson I take from Bloch and Levitas and others is that utopia is irreducible. It is everywhere, without my permission in that sense. The possible is part of the present. Anticipation and the desire for a better way of living are always and everywhere part of that. What matters is what we do with them. Utopia is also, as any of us here, I hope, can attest, both fascinatingly and frustratingly multi-dimensional. Refusing singular definitions, eluding attempts to pin it down. For me, then, utopia is constitutively, definitionally, and generatively ambiguous. If it's the desire for a better way of living and being, it's critical and creative, cognitive and affective, individual and collective, abstract and concrete, compensatory and change-making, realistic and fantastical, constituted in the tension between all those different poles, sitting precisely between the world we have and the world as we want it to be. And for that reason, I hope, just hope, that utopia is stronger than any singular affect, register or modality, not reducible to hope or optimism, formalism or politics. Its strength is in its multiplicity, and a multifaceted object or method like utopia is the only possible match for a wicked problem like climate change. Utopia is ubiquitous, I think, and it's tentacular, I hope, after Donna Haraway again. And its tentacles may be the tools we need for a better Anthropocene.